My name is Ramya Sivasubramanian. I went to Georgetown University, the School of Foreign Service there, and I completed my circumnavigation in the year 2000. My research topic for my foundation research scholarship was to look at the impact and success of renewable energy-based electrification in rural areas. So my title was Power for the People, and I went to countries to examine the impact that electrification had in rural areas that previously did not have power, and to understand really how that impacted them socially, economically, but also to understand what made those kinds of projects successful. On my trip, I got to visit the Dominican Republic, Egypt, India, Nepal, Thailand, and Australia. And then I made my way all the way back home. I learned about the fellowship through the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. They shared the information about this opportunity with students who met the qualifying requirements. And immediately it really just appealed to me. I was studying international issues, I was studying international environmental issues, and I thought, wow, what an amazing way to actually get to see firsthand the kinds of things that I'm learning about in textbooks and on paper and in classrooms, but to really understand what that looks like in the day-to-day. So, I started thinking about, what my topic could be pretty much as soon as I got that letter kind of explaining what this opportunity was, and was thrilled when I eventually was able to secure the opportunity. Yeah. One of the main reasons I was interested in this particular topic, renewable energy-based rural electrification, was two things that I was very interested in studying and was studying at the time, which is the environment and issues around environment and climate change, as well as really understanding the impacts that can have on people. So growing up, I had a very clear understanding of how the environment impacts people. My brother had asthma, so it was very easy to see when air quality was bad and how that impacted people day to day. That's why I ended up studying those issues and wanting to really dive into understanding the environment, climate change, and these huge international, global environmental topics. As I sort of got more into my studies at Georgetown and kind of started to understand these issues, I learned some interesting things. One of which was part of the reason we weren't seeing at that time, in the year 2000, as much renewable energy in the United States, for example, was that it was more costly than the power that we turn on when we have the flip of a switch. More costly than grid power. But I also learned in my classes that that wasn't necessarily true everywhere in the world and for all people. So for example, I learned that in many countries, there were millions and actually billions of people worldwide who didn't have grid power, had no electricity. And for those people, the cost of getting that was so high that they were likely never to see that happen in their lifetimes. On the other hand, you could have a solar system or wind power, and that actually ended up being cheaper for people in these rural areas where the grid was not able to reach. And so it was sort of this interesting dynamic where this technology that could have a real impact on climate change, on the environment, on the air we breathe, was too expensive in the US, but actually was more cost competitive in really remote rural areas than having the power grid extend all the way to them. It also just, part of the reason I was interested in not just understanding sort of the environmental piece of it, but really understanding the social, the economic, the day-to-day human impact of that is just learning in my classes that billions of people across the world don't have what we take for granted every day, which is the ability to flip a switch, have lights turn on, and how that impacts them and their economic lives and their social lives, and just in all kinds of ways. So that was kind of what spurred my interest in this topic, coming from a place of wanting to see more renewable energy in the world, understanding what some of the barriers were in the US and how those dynamics might be really different in other places. The first country I went to was the Dominican Republic. And part of the reason I went there was actually one of the case studies that I read about in one of my classes was based there, where they were using renewable energy in remote areas to help power wells, water wells. So that was a way that they could, rather than having hand pumps or pumps powered by diesel generation, they could use that to get water. Again, day to day, many of us take for granted the ability to turn on our faucets, get water whenever we want. And yes, we pay a water bill, but we don't have to put a lot of work into that. In contrast, in many communities who are on well water, you have to potentially travel quite far to actually get to the well. You may have to actually put in physical labor to get that. You may be limited in how much you can access with hand pumps versus mechanical pumps. So that was one of the case studies that I learned about, and that was kind of what piqued my interest, and I was curious to just learn more about that. The next country I went to was Egypt, and they were using wind and solar power in really interesting ways as well, in really remote rural areas where they didn't have access to the grid or electricity. So that was another one that I had kind of started to learn about. My list of countries evolved over the process as well. So Egypt actually wasn't one of the first countries that I initially had on my very first proposal and application. I had Morocco because that was a country that I had also heard about, read about, has large remote populations and rural populations. And so but based on some factors and some of the advice that I got from the Circumnavigators Club Foundation and from my advisors, I pivoted sort of countries for a few different reasons. The next country I went to was India. And in India, they were using similarly solar power and to power water pumps that were used not just for drinking water, but also for irrigating crops and agriculture. So really sustained people's ability to grow more food, both for themselves, but also to generate income for themselves. And they had a lot of infrastructure and organizations that were helping to support that work, helping rural farmers and other rural villagers be able to access that kind of opportunity. In Nepal, I visited several really remote villages in the mountains in the Himalayas, and they were using renewable electricity just to have access to lighting. And they were using that lighting not just to further their education, but also do income generating activities. So for many of us, it's hard to imagine that your life is dictated by when there's sun and when there's not. But it really opened up hours of time in the day when it would otherwise be dark. They would otherwise have to rely on kerosene or wood stoves to generate small amounts of light. They were instead able to power with solar energy actual light bulbs and be able to use that to read, to do other things that they weren't really fully able to do before. And then in Thailand, I had planned to visit a village on a remote island. So similarly, it was going to be really hard to extend the grid to this remote island. And they were using solar power to help provide electricity to those villages as well. Unfortunately, due to some unforeseen circumstances, I wasn't able to actually access that island, maybe perhaps indicating how remote some of these places actually are. So had to do some pivots to instead find other people to talk to in Thailand as well. In Australia, I learned of some Aboriginal communities who are, again, very remote, far off. Australia is very vast, and there are many populations that are very widely dispersed. And so similarly, grid connectivity was a challenge for them, but they were using solar power to be able to power their homes. So that's sort of the kind of full arc of where I went and what places I picked and why. There's still several interviews that I remember to this day. In each country, I visited and spoke with a mix of government officials, oftentimes nonprofit organizations, as well as the actual people who are benefiting from the renewable energy technologies and investments. And in each country, it was a little bit different. So in some cases, it was government investment. In some cases, it was nonprofit investment. In some cases, it was private industries who were supporting this. And in some cases, it was finance. So people were getting loans or grants to be able to install this. And so talking to different people, understanding what factors maybe led to success, and by success, really trying to define that in terms of the actual impact it was having on the ground. So one thing that I learned very clearly in having these interviews is even if something looked like a success on paper, it might not actually be a success in real life. And so one example that really stands out is as I was traveling in Nepal, visiting these remote villages, in one of the villages, one of the systems was entirely in English. So they had no way of understanding when a light went on, what that meant. They knew it probably wasn't good if a red light went on this system, but they had no way of decoding, because they didn't speak English, didn't read English, what that meant. So on the one hand, it looked like it was a success, but on the other hand, there maybe was room for improvement when you talk to the people who are actually using it day to day. In contrast, just one village away, the system that was installed had like not words, but icons that were a little bit more easy to understand, regardless of what language you spoke or whether you read or not. You could kind of tell, what, an electricity symbol or like a lightning bolt symbol means. You could kind of tell what an X means. So it was a little bit clearer, and just something as simple as that had a real impact on someone's ability to actually use and benefit from this system. So that was one thing that stood out in terms of just kind of really understanding the impact that it had. I think some of the highlights from my circumnavigation were really the people that I got to meet along the way. And that actually even started before I went on my trip. So one of the things that I did when I found out that I was selected was kind of research, is there anything happening in the US before I leave that I could do, but that would sort of get me connected to some of the people in these places? And I actually identified that somehow miraculously timed during my spring break that year, there was going to be a conference up at the UN in New York that was on a very similar topic of sustainable development. And I decided that it would be an amazing opportunity to go up there, actually meet some people from the countries that I was planning to visit and make some connections. And that was amazing. I mean, just the reception that I'm just a student, right? I'm not an important delegate from any country, just a student who's there to learn. And people who are their representatives from their countries were excited, enthusiastic to talk to me, share what they knew, and share who else I might want to talk to in their countries, providing me contacts. So that was just really amazing to see just how open and welcoming people were, even from before the start. And that really continued, I feel like, throughout the trip. And one of the things that I had done ahead of time is really just try to reach out to as many people who knew people in these places. And I was actually able to set up like post-family stays in most of the countries I visited. So not all, but in Egypt, in India, in Nepal, Thailand, and Australia, I was able to have host families that I stayed with during the time there that I in some cases knew directly, but in many cases I knew through a friend of a friend of a friend who I talked to in the months leading up to my travel. And that was really an amazing part of the experience for me. It allowed me to, I think, see things and experience things that I might not otherwise have had a chance to without sort of that local knowledge. And that was really great. So in Egypt, for example, having, my host family kind of take me to different places that I would have gone as a tourist. I would have gone in my spare time just to see, the museum there, to go see the pyramids, but to go with a family who could kind of explain what some of these things meant to them and, how they were viewing it was great. And then I got to see some things that maybe aren't off the usual path. They took me to a night market one night in Cairo, which I probably wouldn't have gone to on my own as a single female traveler. But it was great to sort of go see that bazaar, sort of see what that experience was like, and participate in some of the haggling and find some things to take home for me too. And similarly in Nepal, the host family that I stayed with wasn't actually supposed to be my host family. All they were supposed to do was pick me up at the airport and take me to the hostel that I was staying at. So they did that. They met me there. They took me to this hostel and helped me carry my bags in. And they said, hey, you know what? Like, this looks really crowded and it looks like you might not have the best experience. Would you want to stay with us? And they invited me into their home, and I actually took them up on the offer, and it was just a really great opportunity to get to know them and understand, a little bit more about the culture directly. So it was really an amazing part of the experience. And that's not to mention the people that I, kind of visited and met with through the research itself. I remember in Nepal, talking with people who are working at a nonprofit who are really trying to support these kinds of efforts, both because it would help remote villagers gain electricity, gain economic opportunity, gain educational opportunities. But they were based in Kathmandu and, kind of shared, not just what they had to share in terms of the research, but also, we went out to a restaurant together and, got a drink together. So it was sort of those kinds of friendships and those kinds of people that you meet along the way that I think really stood out to me as a highlight of the experience. So the research was obviously amazing. I learned a ton. And I think I came away from the trip realizing just how important those people and those friendships and even those chance encounters kind of along the way were. Maybe because my last stop was Australia, and I ended up doing a lot of spending a lot of time at a university there, doing some of the research. I think I was sort of eased back in, both because of the English-speaking country that I was in, but also because of the setting. I did a good chunk of interviews at that university campus in Perth. So I feel like that helped ease my transition back. But I think, each stop along the way, there was definitely a learning curve. Each place is very different, both in terms of language, but also in terms of geography, culture, just the sense of the dichotomy between generally having spent time in both cities in each place, which were very large, big cities, but then also traveling to very remote rural areas. So I feel like I had a little bit of culture shock kind of at each phase along the way. That culture shock of going from Kathmandu, very big, bustling, huge city with tons of people, to hiking miles out into the mountains and not seeing anyone for hours. So it was really kind of hallmark of the experience that there was just these huge shifts in what I saw and experienced, even within my time at each country. Once I returned and started working on my research paper, it was great to work really closely with Brian Evans to kind of guide and shape what that would look like to fit the foundation requirements. I ultimately decided not to try to combine it with a senior thesis or other paper, for example. The requirements were slightly different. And while I could have done that, it felt like it would be easier to just sort of keep those to be two separate things. And I'm kind of glad that I did it that way, because I think the foundation paper allowed me an opportunity to not just explore the interesting research and the outcomes and the conclusions that I made through the research that I did, and the things that I saw on my trip, but it allowed me to integrate some of the kind of more personal components to what it's like to do a trip like this, which I appreciated. So I had, different text boxes that might give, that were relevant to the research, but might also give a little bit more of a flavor of, the actual experience of being. So one example was, and this stands out, in one of the countries that I was visiting, staying with one of the families in the remote village that I was in overnight, just to sort of experience what that was like. And I remember very distinctly, we were having dinner and it was dark already, and the lighting was really quite dim. And so just the idea of eating in the dark every day, something simple that, again, you don't really necessarily think about or take for granted what it feels like or is like when that same family can turn on a switch and actually have lighting to be able to see what they're doing, cooking dinner, see what they're chopping, see what they're putting in, and be able to have a conversation where you can actually see the other person a little bit more clearly. Just those kind of intangible things that, maybe wouldn't make sense in a senior thesis kind of paper were kind of anecdotes that I could include that helped kind of I think round out the foundation scholar paper. The topic that I studied in my foundation research paper is something or things that I work on to this day. So I continue to this day, 25 years later, to work in the environmental field. I work at an international environmental nonprofit organization, and I work sort of at this intersection of community and the environment. So the lessons that I learned in doing that research, I think, have carried with me through this day. One of the things that I saw really clearly was that for something to be successful, it actually needed that community buy-in, that community support, even that sort of like ownership, community ownership from the start, which in some ways actually wasn't what I was expecting going in. You would think that a project where someone is just given a free grant of this renewable energy technology to use, that would actually be the most impactful on their lives. But actually the approaches where people were taking out loans to do that and then using that technology to turn on the lights at night and either get a better education or produce some income generating activity, like those actually ended up being better in terms of the impact that they had on people. And so to this day, I work at this intersection between the environment and people, and I kind of, trace a lot of that to those experiences that I had in those countries, really seeing what it meant for people day to day to experience the benefits and the impacts of what technologies, renewable technologies could bring. So not just the environmental impact, but the social, the economic impacts as well. I wouldn't say that I feel like it had a direct impact on the next step. I ended up deciding to go to law school, in part because it felt like a tool that seemed really useful and necessary in making sure that we were pushing environmental policies as far as we could go. So that said, where I am today, I think is definitely continued the trajectory of what I chose to study in the paper and what I studied in undergrad and beyond. One of the most amazing things that I got out of this experience was just a lot more self-awareness. Being alone on your own, traveling around the world is a pretty tremendous experience. You have a lot of time with people, a lot of time doing the research, but you also have a lot of time to yourself to kind of think and reflect day to day. And I took to heart one of the pieces of advice that I was given before I started this trip, which is to start journaling while I was there. And so I have this amazing record of my thoughts, my reflections, my process during that time. And even sitting with it afterwards, I think I learned even more about myself in the process of writing the paper, remembering that, understanding how to connect sort of very abstract theoretical research ideas to the people that I met, the people that I saw. And so I think that was a really important connection for me. In terms of my own self-awareness and growth, I feel like it really pushed me outside of my comfort zone. Even from before I even started the trip, sort of doing those things like going up to the UN in New York and just going up to total strangers who were their representatives from their countries and saying, hi, I'm doing this project, would love to talk to you, and having people be receptive to that. So that was, for me, sort of part of that is really just putting myself out there. And realizing that when you do, more often than not, people were helpful. People were excited to talk. People were excited to help out. And so that's sort of, I think maybe something I didn't fully expect. I expected to have a lot more no's. And certainly I did have plenty of no's. No, I don't have time to meet, or I can't meet, or I'm not here now. But I also had a lot more yeses, I think, than I was expecting. So I think that life lesson of just putting yourself out there, giving it a try and seeing what happens, was one that I tested out over and over and over again on that trip. And, sort of more often than not, it paid off. So I think that's one of those things that I kind of carried with me afterwards, and certainly to this day. And, now I feel like I'm at the point where I'm trying to pay that forward. So, I get those emails from students or email, requests to say, hey, I saw this, I saw your bio, could I talk to you? I actually try to say yes to those things. Just knowing again, how impactful that was for me when I was in that student role. My role as coordinator for the foundation, I think, is in some ways relatively new. So I will be stepping into that role sort of more fully as the co-chair in the coming year. But I've been on the interviewer side of the equation for a number of years now. And I think that's been a really interesting continuation of the experience for me, is seeing other students go through this process, seeing how it evolves for them. And I think one of the things that I've learned from this side of the table is maybe that I didn't fully appreciate when I was on the other side of the table as a student, as an applicant, as a scholar, is that really it's more about the back and forth than having the exact perfect thing from the start. And part of that comes from knowing things will change, whether you mean for them to or not. Country situations change, you may have to make pivots. Unexpected things happen on the ground, challenges arise. And so that process of that back and forth, I think, starts as early as the interview process with, the feedback that's provided. And that's really there to kind of help you along the way. And that's something that I think I didn't fully appreciate until I was in the role of interviewing and helping students think that through and really understand that process. The advice that I would give a current student going through the application process, one is to really take advantage of the resources around you. That includes the resources of what's worked in the past, but also the resources around you in terms of your professors, your courses, what you're studying, to really pick a topic that is going to excite you. You're going to spend hours and hours on this. And so having it be something that you are interested in, excited about, and care deeply about is sort of the first piece of advice that I would give. And then it's continuing that. Once you find something that excites you, is interesting, really doing the work on the front end as early as you can to kind of try to do as much of that research. Whether you get the grant or not, quite honestly, like that process of going through and really trying to hone in on what that topic is and then doing the research to support a proposal is an invaluable skill and opportunity. So we just encourage students to kind of take advantage of that to its fullest too. Again, doing research beyond what you've already learned in your classes, doing additional research in terms of talking to people potentially, your professors and others to try to get that as honed in as possible. And then I would really encourage you to talk to the people who've done it before. There is a series of grantees that come before you, at least one of whom is still on campus. So, finding that person, talking to them, really understanding how it worked for them and what their advice would be, I think is a key part of it. So that's some of the advice that I'd give for anyone considering it. And if you're on the fence, don't be, go for it. I think it's, again, like I said, whether you get the opportunity or not, the process itself is invaluable and will help you if you decide to do a senior thesis or something else down the line. So yeah, I would say go for it. The advice that I'd have for someone who is selected for this process is to continue to educate yourself about not just your topic. That probably seems pretty straightforward, and I think most people have to do that, would do that in order to develop the proposal further. But also really to educate yourself about the country and its people, everything you can about the travel process. My tips for while you're out on your travels is really to prepare for the unexpected. I think from the day one of my trip, I definitely saw that despite the best planning, not everything is going to go exactly according to plan. So for me, day one, I landed in the Dominican Republic. I took a ride to the hostel where I was supposed to be staying. And I arrived there and there was a sign that said that it was closed. So that, again, was not something that I was prepared for. I had researched this place ahead of time and I was told that it would be open 24 hours a day, but it said that they had closure hours and weren't checking in people until the next morning. I still ended up knocking on the door and trying to get in, and eventually it was just after the closure at 10 p.m. So they took pity on me and they said, okay, we'll make an exception. You're here, we'll let you in. But it was a good lesson in starting the trip that even though I had researched ahead of time and it said it was going to be open, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the case. So having backup plans and contingency plans, I think, is an important part. But being able to kind of think on the fly of what you might need to do. So similarly, in Nepal, I ended up spraining my ankle a couple days into a hike in the mountains and needed to figure out what to do. Turning back would have required a day and a half of going back, which not sure I could have done on the foot that I had. But talking to the people that I was with and talking to the villagers there, they said that there was a shortcut way to get to a dirt road where I could get an access to a vehicle to come get me. So I did that. But no matter how well you plan, and there's always going to be something that doesn't go quite right or goes wrong. And I think an important part of the preparation is really making sure that both you do what you can to prepare ahead of time, have contingency plans, but also prepare yourself just to be resilient and flexible and try to figure out the best solution to get you where you need to be safely and securely. No matter what happens. For a returning grantee, the advice I have for working on your paper and your presentation is to work really closely with your foundation point person to make sure that you understand early and upfront what the requirements are and what would be most compelling. I think that can save people a lot of time and headache to do that as early on as possible and as soon in the process as possible, so that you know what you're expected to deliver and that you can actually build in the time to do that. It's interesting sort of being on the coordinator side and seeing different students approach that in different ways. Particularly when you're trying to combine it with a thesis, really making sure you keep both sets of requirements in mind, I think would be an important piece of advice. So just really making sure that as soon as you get back and you start thinking about what's to come, making sure you have your thesis requirements clear and the timelines clear, as well as the foundation requirements clear and the timelines clear so that you could sort of build that out. And then also to remind people that there might be additional research or follow-ups that you might want to do. So for example, one of the things that I was able to do is do a little bit of follow-up with people after the fact via email if there was something that I wanted to confirm, whether it was confirming that I could include something that they said or that they quoted, or even just following up on maybe an additional piece that I didn't think to ask in the moment. I think those are the kinds of things that, again, just also being sure that you prepare for that kind of time of additional research. It's not all complete at the end of your trip, that more of that will be happening even as you're writing it. For someone who's never heard of this program before, the way that I would pitch it is the opportunity to travel around the world doing a research project of your choosing. It's completely up to you what you choose to study. Where you choose to go is sort of more of a process of iteration to make sure that you choose a safe and good place and a list of countries that fully meets your requirements, but also the foundations. But it is one of the most amazing opportunities out there for undergrad students. There's not a lot that really kind of matches it. To be able to do your own research as a 20-year-old, I think is pretty rare. And to be able to do that internationally is even rarer. So I think just in terms of selling points, I would say just the opportunity of a lifetime. Especially these days, it feels so critical to have investments in people being able to see the world outside of their narrow bubble. And I think one of the things that I really take with me now, and part of the reason I continue to be a part of this effort, is the motto of the Circumnavigators Club is through friendship to leave the world a little better than we found it. That's what I experienced throughout my trip. People in different countries opening up their doors to me, being able to have those kinds of conversations with the specific people that I was interviewing, but also people that I would meet along the way, and just learning more about them, learning that we are actually more similar than we are different. And even though we are different, there are lots of things that hold us together, and that friendship is a really critical piece of it. So I think the opportunity to invest in people being global citizens and really thinking about the world outside of themselves, I think is hugely critical and especially needed right now.